So in order to do that, I think that we're going to have to bring back some of the instruments that we've had in the past, and some of them we haven't liked that well, but we may have to continue with them. One of them is using the loan rate to actually support prices. Of course, right now the loan rate is a number that they use to determine direct payments, really, a type of direct payments, the loan deficiency payment. But in the past, the loan rate has been used as a way to support prices. And the way that's done is that, and most of you I'm sure know this, that you can take your, after you've harvested your grain, you can get a loan on that grain, and they give you the loan amount that would be the loan rate times the number of bushels that you pledge as collateral. And then if after 9 months, for example, the price of the crop is below that loan rate, you can turn the grain over to the government, and that will be the full payment of the loan and the interest. And they have no recourse, that's why it's called non-recourse, to come back and get more money. So if all farmers did that, and of course it doesn't have to be all, just a certain proportion of them, you can guarantee that the price would be at that loan rate level. Okay? Now, we replaced that with the loan deficiency payment in recent legislation, so that you essentially just get the difference between the loan rate and the actual price as a payment, and so it doesn't support the price. The price of corn could go to 50 cents. There is absolutely nothing stopping it. If we had a situation in which output increased tremendously in this country, increased in Argentina, and it did it for 2 years, there is no limit to how low price can go. We don't have a floor on price anymore. Okay, and I think it's important that the people that use the grain have to pay a larger percentage of the cost. But also, it eliminates the complaint of farmers around the world that we're, and justifiably so I might say, that we're dumping commodities on the world market at below the cost of production. I say we're an equal opportunity dumper. We dump internationally, but we also dump domestically. We give everybody below the cost of production for the grain. If we did do that, we could reactivate some of the ever-normal granary aspects of Henry A. Wallace, and of course part of that would come about by the operating the support price as it was before as a non-recourse loan. But I do think that we would need to incorporate a farmer-owned reserve like we've had before. And of course this concept of an ever-normal granary, which Henry A. Wallace based on the story of Joseph in the Bible, really, where preparing for the 7 years of crop shortfall during the 7 years of plenty. And he had talked and thought about that and written about it and had editorials about it as early as 1912. But actually it didn't get implemented until the late 1930s. But we don't have that anymore. We don't have a stock like that anymore. And I think that that's one of the first things that we need to implement as part of a multi-stage way of getting back to a farm policy that makes some sense, and we'll talk more about the reasons for that in a little bit. If we do that, we can really establish a price band where there would be a floor as to how low prices could go, but you'd also have a release price for the stocks, which would put a ceiling on it too, a soft ceiling anyway. And of course, farmers don't like to have ceilings. They'd like to be able to get all they can. But I would argue that a ban like that would be in the long run best interest of both consumers and producers, because there's no question in my mind that it's $12, $15 beans that is your worst enemy when it comes 5 years down the road, because that will be the thing that will increase output in other countries to a very large extent. I argue, and I'll probably talk about this later too, but I argue that there is a band, as long as you stay within a band, and I don't know whether that's 475 and 650 or what it is for soybeans, but if you stay in that band, I don't think there's going to be any difference. I don't think there's any difference whatsoever in the way Argentina and Brazil are going to plant their soybeans. They are going to continue to expand, and they are going to do it no matter where that price is in that band. So if we have it at the higher part of that, of course, what we're doing is we're providing more of the revenue coming from the market, and we're providing more revenue to farmers around the world. Now, if you get outside that band, then I think that's when you have the response that we need to worry about. So if we worry about raising the loan rate by 5 cents, or even moving it up towards the top end of wherever that band is, we kind of define where it is, of course. I don't think that we really get much impact on it. So we have a price band that we're working with, but also we are going to think about probably having some kind of an international humanitarian reserve, which is separate from commercial agriculture, okay? Separate from it. And this would be available only in the case of extreme famine, and we would all know exactly when that was. But it would be segregated from the other price stabilization mechanisms and the other supply management programs, and would be something that maybe we would have various sites around the world where we'd have reserves. We'd have criteria that would be decided on internationally for when it should be released. We might have part of it in cash so that we can use that to buy local products. But something would probably need to be in place, is the idea, that would essentially take care of the extreme situations. And it had to be done in a way in which we didn't harm the local producers. And of course, that's been one of the criticisms that we've had in the past, isn't it? That we dump grains over in other countries and it lowers the price, and then they have less incentive to produce. And obviously, that's an important problem. But so it would have to be done in a way so that you would minimize that situation. All right. Coupled with this price-supported reserve system, I think we'd have to establish at least the ability to manage supply. Any other industry would do that. They wouldn't have a productive capacity that they would use all the time. The electric utilities, they need to have a reserve. Obviously, they need to be able to hit the highest peak day for heat or for air conditioning, but they sure aren't going to use that capacity all the time. And no other industry really does that too, either. And we need to have the ability, I think, to control it. And if there is any example of a commodity that is important to have the capacity to produce beyond the demand, it must be food. So it's obviously very important to have the research to expand the productive capacity of food for this generation and the next, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we would have to use that full level of production all the time to bear down on the market. Okay. Now, I don't like set-asides. Farmers don't like set-asides. Agribusiness sure as heck doesn't like set-asides. I think that there are some opportunities here that we can benefit both energy and the ag industries. And this is the one that I am the most excited about, actually. The ones we've talked about so far, we know how to do those. FSA could handle that tomorrow morning if we wanted to change it. Some of what we're going to talk about from here on will take a little more time. But they are alternatives to set aside and some of the negatives that we see with previous policies. And I really believe that if this opportunity were embraced by the executive and the legislative branches, we could solve a lot of problems, and some of them are very thorny, and we could save taxpayer money in the process. In fact, I think that what we are really thinking about here would be looking towards a new frontier crop for agriculture, much like the phenomenal increase that we've had in soybean acreage over the last 5 decades. So I think what we're thinking about here is there any way that we can come up with something that would benefit both the energy and food production, and at the same time have other kinds of attributes as well. And I'm not really talking about ethanol and biodiesel. Obviously, that's been an important, very important, and positive impact on crop demand, and will in the future. But what I am talking about is growing fuel that can be co-fired with coal or other traditional fuel sources to produce electricity. And I know that might sound a little bit outlandish, but it really isn't. If you think about it, agriculture has been in the energy business for a long time. We used to grow our own energy for the horses that plowed the fields and took us to town and took us to church. Everything that we did with horses, we've essentially converted that energy source to fossil fuel with with tractors and all the rest of it. And we also use our land for producing wood for home heating and that sort of thing. So we've been in the energy business. It's just that we haven't been in it as strong lately as we were. So it's not as outlandish as it might seem, in my view. What I'm talking about is a way of generating a new product that would provide a way of reducing our dependence on foreign oil and reduce the amount of fossil carbon that's going into the atmosphere, and would provide a lot of other benefits as well. And at the same time would not compete with other kinds of crops. George Naylor, who's going to be up here in a little bit, he says that farmers produce three things. They produce carbohydrates, they produce protein, they produce oil. Okay? Now, when we talk about agriculture, it really doesn't matter whether we take soybean land and we put it into corn, or we take corn land and put it into sunflowers or whatever. We're still producing those one or more of those three commodities, or those three attributes. So if we're going to get ahead, one way to do that is to find a crop that doesn't add to those three elements. And there are a number of crops that could be looked at in that regard. I'm not pushing any one of them, although I'll use switchgrass as a example to illustrate. But there are a number of them that could be used to coal-fire coal or other kinds of fossil fuel, so that we could make electricity and have the benefits of reducing the amount of acreage that would be in regular crops. It would reduce the pollution from the fossil fuel. If it's a perennial, like switchgrass is, you would be able to you would be able to improve the soil condition and reduce soil erosion. And it turns out that you also could save taxpayer money, and I'll explain how that's done in just a minute. If you took about between 30 and 40 million acres of cropland that's currently in regular major crop production and you put it into switchgrass, you could have a lot of benefits, according to the analysis that we did, and we used the model that was referred to a few moments ago to do that. For one thing, you can increase the environment doubly because you have less pollutants coming out of the fossil fuel. You also can reduce the amount of soil erosion because you're talking about more like a hay crop or a pasture crop that stays in the on the soil for a number of years. You don't have to till it every year. And at the same time, you'll provide higher prices then to farmers for the other commodities. They'll also get a price for the switchgrass as well. And you can take a little bit of the government payments and make switchgrass competitive on a cost per BTU basis, so that the utility can afford to do it, and you could still save a lot of money. You could still have a lot of money left over in terms of government payments. We're talking about $20 billion here. Okay, so to me, this is just the kind of take care of business approach that the Wallaces would be interested in, and to me is a fairly exciting possibility. And I understand that these kinds of things take a long time to develop. It wouldn't be something that would be done right away necessarily. It takes a vision, and it also would take a lot of support in Congress and in the White House to get it done. There's been some work done on it now. You can now use some of your CRP land in certain areas, pilot programs for switchgrass, and again, I say switchgrass because that's just an illustrative example. But the thing is, can we merge the two policy areas of agriculture and energy and be able to have benefits that would allow us to be less dependent on foreign oil, get better prices for our commodities, have lower government payments, and improve the environment? And that would be the approach. All right, now that's two of the three. No doubt about it, excess capacity is not just a short-term thing. And you know, In the 1920s and 30s, that's exactly what they thought it was. They thought that, you know, the demand will come back pretty soon and everything will be just fine. And it never did happen. Because there was always, partly because of the conditions in Europe, because they were extrapolating the kind of export demand that they had during the 1920s from that point on. And we know that other countries don't necessarily operate that way, that they would prefer to produce on their own. We'll talk more about that. So it's not a new thing. We've had the ability and have continued to have the ability to produce more than we can have a demand for at a reasonable price. I believe that it's going to be even worse in the future because it's going to be worldwide and not just in the U.S. That doesn't mean that I don't think that we can't affect price in the U.S. by how much we produce. I still think we can right now. I do. And if you look at the relationship between prices in our country and prices in a country like Argentina, this is for corn, you can see that there's a very high correlation there between the two. Now, other countries it's not as great, but it's always there. If we have, when we change our price, the prices in competing countries and prices around the world do tend to change, and they're going to continue to do that. But I'm not sure that they will at some point in the future. At some point in the future, we may not be able to do that. And I say that because our productive capacity is growing worldwide at rates that are unbelievable, in my view. And that being the case, excess capacity and productive capacity overproduction is probably going to be a worldwide problem in the future. And why is that? Well, we get a bushel increase in yield per year for a commodity. That's a lot. We have countries around the world, though, that could increase their yield of corn or other commodities by a very large percentage over 2 or 3 years. We have the opportunity to see yield increases in a number of countries at a much higher rate than we're used to seeing. And a lot of that is because we have these companies here that are helping to make that happen. They see an opportunity. And they are going to invest in plant and equipment and provide services and inputs in, you name the country, China, Brazil, Russia, Ukraine, wherever it is. They're going to be increasing, they're going to be increasing their presence, and they will be increasing the yields in those countries. And of course, it's a lot different now. We used to, when yields increased in this country, well, we kind of thought it was our domain. Now, with the rate at which varieties can be improved in other countries, at the rate at which information is transmitted around the world at the speed of light, we're in a different situation than we were and ever been in past in agriculture. And then there's the acreage situation. There's a lot of acreage that can be brought into production now that was in production in the past that isn't anymore. The Ukraine, for example. What did we used to call the Ukraine? The breadbasket of the world. Now, it may not be the breadbasket of the world in the future, but when they get their incentives in place, you can bet that they're going to be a lot better at producing output than they have been in the last few decades. And it's going to happen. I believe that. Same way with Russia and other places. But we also have land that's going to be coming in that hasn't been in production before. And of course, we all know about Brazil. But it's really a very serious situation in my view. Brazil can bring in as much land in the future as we currently have in production right now. They can bring as much land into production in the future as we in the U.S. have in production right now. Okay? So we're talking about a tremendous amount of possible expansion. And China, in the question and answer periods, we'll probably talk about China a little bit more, but China has about 100 million acres that they're going to be bringing into production that is high in alkali. But they have developed some wheat varieties especially, but other commodities as well, that is tolerant of this, and they're going to be bringing it in. And, you know, might as well just say it right now. I mean, I think that the optimism that we have about China as being a customer is probably way overblown. I would argue that they are more likely to be a competitor the next 5 or 10 years than they are a customer, except for John Deere and for Cargill and for other multinationals. They'll be good customers of those folks. And even soybeans. If you read what's coming out of China and soybeans now, what they say is the soybean was first developed in China. And I'll be darned if we're going to be dependent on anybody for soybeans in the future. Now, they are right now. Will they be off and on? Sure they will. But their idea is to divide the country into two kind of areas for soybeans. In one area, they're going to have non-GMO soybeans. What do you suppose they'll do with those? Export them. Nobody else is filling that market. Over here, they're going to have GMO soybeans, and they'll use those directly, okay? So they have a plan in place. How long will it take them to get it there? I don't know. Will it happen? You never know. But that is their intent. And I believe that they have an intent in general to provide for themselves. And they did not join WTO so that they could be a better customer for the U.S. farmer, I guarantee you. I argue that the reason that they joined WTO was because they needed a way, a lever, to get the folks that they knew were going to have to be adjusted differently out of agriculture, give them a motivation to be able to withstand that. Because they say, okay, listen, here's the deal. If we don't do this, and it's going to hurt, but if we don't do it, we have two choices. We can starve or we can become dependent on the rest of the world for our food. And I say, well, shoot, neither one of those look very good. What do I need to do? I really believe that that they have done it as much to provide incentive and cover for some of the things that they know they're going to have to do. There's going to be a lot of adjustment in China in the next few years, and I think that they were getting ready to do it. Now, we have talked about commodity programs, and we all know that commodity programs are just one part of farm policy. But one thing I want to say is that there are some unique things that relate to the price and income problems of agriculture that require us to look at commodity policy separately. And while we need to look at some of the others, I think that we have to keep that in mind. Having said that, I just want to say a little bit about conservation, and there are all kinds of others that we could talk about, but it's really important, I think, for us to lift that up. There are, of course, needs to do more in each of these areas, because we know that all of them are our future in agriculture, and we need to be sure that we take care of the future. All right, now I can hear you out there. You don't think I can hear you, but I can hear you. You're saying, holy smoke, price supports, reserves, set aside. What are you thinking? We don't want to go back to those policies that we had in the past. Those are the failed policies. Give me a break. Well, I'll tell you. I've seen what's happened after we eliminated them or made them ineffective, and I'm convinced that many of the reasons that people didn't like them, many of the criticisms, really aren't valid. And I want to talk with you a little bit about some of those reasons for that. One is that, well, we were convinced in the 1980s that if we lowered price, we'd get our exports back. We were convinced. I remember people saying, we will take the EU and take it to its knees. They will reduce their production and we will get that wheat market back. Well, it didn't work out that way. And it hasn't worked, even all these years that we've had lower prices, we have actually had less exports in total than we did in the early 80s. Here's a graph that I like to show. What we've got here is red is exports in volume, that is bushels, tons, or whatever, for the 8 major crops in red. And we've indexed it to 1979 equal to 1. And then we've done the same thing for domestic demand, which is in blue, for the 8 major crops. And then we just put the population line in there just to show it. Now, here's what I really believe. I think folks have embedded in their mind that this line that started off at this slope has continued on like that. And I just think that's what they're thinking. I argue, if you went to your PTA, you went to your Sunday school class, if you went to a group of folks that were in your community, and you said, what has been the driving force of the grain markets in the last quarter century, exports or domestic demand? What would they say? They would say exports. A large share of them, if not all. And why is that? Because that's what they hear. That's what they've been told, that it's been exports. Ain't been so. Since the mid-1980s, we have had export demand that has been virtually flat. Obviously, there's quite a bit of variation, and if you were at this point and you were moving up to there, you could have visions of it going like that, but it didn't. It's been very flat during this period. Domestic demand, on the other hand, has been increasing, rocking right along at a fairly constant rate. We used to say that it couldn't increase any faster in population, but actually it has. And why is that? Because we're using some of that now for ethanol and other kinds of non-food uses for land. And so domestic demand has been increasing at a much faster rate than exports. The other thing that people say is set aside, set aside, set aside. Now, if we do a set aside, what's going to happen is that other countries will plant it. If we don't plant it, other countries will. And, every place you go, you hear that. The farmers would say that. The government officials would say that. Commodity organizations would say it. Academicians would say it. Everybody says it. But then a number of folks have tried to prove that, and including CARD here at Iowa State, and I've tried it, and you cannot find statistical evidence to support that. Okay? So if you look at the graph, since 1995, what you see is that we've had an increase in acreage for our 9 major competitors at a time when we haven't had any set aside and prices have been declining. Okay? Now, if you look at foreign acreage, that is acreage outside the U.S., if you look at it from 1995 to 2000, you will actually see a slight decline. And we don't have all of them in here, but there is a slight decline. But the reason is that these countries right here have reduced their acreage, but the ones that we were really aiming for, the 9 major competitors, even though we didn't have set aside, they have increased their acreage, and even though our prices have declined, they have increased their acreages. Now, if you look at the past and you try to do a statistical analysis, you come up with exactly the same effect. There are just too many other things that affect the acreages in other countries, and besides that, when do we have set-asides? We have set-asides when prices are low, when there isn't a demand for the commodity to the extent that we'd like to see it anyway. So, these other considerations tend to overwhelm the ones that we think maybe are tremendously important. And again, I would argue that you can have a band of prices, and if you stay within that band, other countries won't react. I do argue that if you did get very high or very low prices, it would make a big difference. But set aside hasn't really had that much of an impact at all, in my view. I can't find it. Nobody else can. If there's a study out there, I haven't been able to uncover it. Let's put it that way. All right. Yeah. So, agribusinesses can affect the amount that they produce. I'm going to argue that total agriculture doesn't have that ability. So just because it's going to have a negative impact on agribusiness does not mean that we shouldn't be considering set aside. And I'm sure that this part right here is true. Or General Electric, or General Motors, or Ford, they don't say, I'm going to continue to produce 3 shifts full time because I got a parts factory in Tennessee that needs me to continue to produce. It just doesn't work that way. But they would have you believe otherwise. It would really be better if farmers would do it on their own. Now, in some commodities, they can a little bit with marketing orders. We're talking about a fairly small geographic area and a particular commodity, and they can do that. But if you talk about corn or wheat that's grown virtually all over the country, it's very hard to get everybody together to agree on it. And here's what I think. If you could get them all together, and if you could convince them that you would get a better price by reducing your output by 15%, and if you did it right, you could explain it to them sufficiently so that they would see it and say, yes, that's in my best interest. And then they get in the car and they say to their spouse, those other people are reducing their output by 15%. We're going to increase ours by 20 and think how much we're going to make. It's just natural for people to think that way. You have to have some kind of a lever. And the only one that really has the lever so far has been the government. Now, it doesn't mean it has to be that way. But it has to be done in a way that it actually has an enforcing arm. And it's hard to find that enforcement arm. Okay. Stock programs. We were told you didn't need them because private industry would go ahead and take care of that for us. And they would use the profit motive to do it. And they could do it at a lower cost. Well, you know, they really haven't done that, and there's no reason to expect them to. If you're really thinking about an ever-normal granary in the tradition of Joseph, where you know it's going to take a long time before you need them, the discount rate has to be such that they can make money with it, and oftentimes that's not the case. But we're talking not about money, we're talking about providing for food, and that's a much different thing. And society, I think, would have a different objective function than industry. The other thing that people would say is that it's too expensive. When we had the FOR, we had a number of millions of bushels that were being paid for storage to farmers at 26.5 cents a bushel. They also had some other charges, of course. But it was for a proportion of the crop. Now, under the current program, for some payments, you get paid for all of the crop at more than 26.5, and then you get paid for a large percentage of it at more than 26.5 every year. So we were talking about millions before, and now we're talking about billions. So I think that everything is relative. And this is important for us to have food for the future, for not only this country in terms of being able to supply our livestock producers in the case of corn and soybean meal, but also to keep Japan from figuring out ways to circumvent us in the future by making arrangements with other countries like they have in the past. Okay. When it comes to the energy thing, I know that there are some people that say, well, you know, we're producers of food, and I think that there are so many people in the country that could use that food that I really hate to use that property for something other than food. And that's, of course, a very legitimate concern. But the real problem there is not that we don't produce enough and have it available for the hungry. The problem is that the hungry can't buy it. And it really doesn't. And so it's not that we are going to improve that possibility. We're going to have, as soon as the rest of those that are hungry have the livelihood and there is a distribution mechanism to get it to them, farmers will do it. There is no question about that. But that doesn't happen to be the major problem. Now, this multinational cooperation, I'll have to admit that that is a little far out. And if somebody would have mentioned that, in fact, somebody did mention that to me 5 years ago, and I thought, what a deal was that? How could you get any group of nations to agree to limit production or in any way manage supply? Well, it ain't going to be easy. But here's what I think. I think that if the excess capacity problem is as bad as I think it's going to be in the future, why, it's possible it might get traction quicker than you think. In general, there are a lot of folks that aren't protected even by the direct payments that we're protected by, right? I mean, with Brazil, if they did get $2 soybeans, they're not going to have anything to compensate that price at all. So if you do have an overcapacity and it affects the major producers around the world, you never know how quickly they might be willing to consider such a thing. Will it happen in my lifetime? I frankly doubt it. But I think that it's something that could happen and might happen down in the future because of the nature of the way agriculture operates. All right. Now here's the overarching criticism that we see. The market knows best. And it is true that economic theory does show that if you mess around with the supply curve or the demand curve or support the price, that the benefits are not as great as the losses, and so you have this dead weight loss, as they call it here. But what we have to remember is that that's for any kind of interference at all, okay? Now, what do you think has been the largest interference in the market? Has there been commodity programs that have moved the supply curve to the left just a little bit once in a while or raised the price? Or has it been the programs that have increased production and moved the supply curve to the right continually since almost the beginning of this nation? I think it's this one. So if you're a free market economist, well then you have to get as upset about the output expanding policies that benefit consumers as you are about the policies that benefit producers from commodity programs. If you are as upset, that's fine. And if you are a free market economist and you want to get rid of commodity programs, the only way to have a free market is to get rid of all programs. You get rid of extension, research, everything, right? That's a free market. Otherwise, you have taxpayers that are shifting the supply curve and in some cases the demand curve around, and that's a no-no for free market economists. So so when somebody says that, well, I say, well, are you also interested in getting rid of these other programs? And usually oftentimes they're getting their money from them, and you know, they don't say that. I don't think that if we had not had the research and extension and the other kinds of programs that have expanded supply, I don't think that we would be talking about commodity programs at all. But that wouldn't be our problem. Our problem would be high prices and people that couldn't afford to buy food. That would be our problem. And so to me, the net beneficiaries of these kinds of policies, the two of them together, we have two, right? We have the policies that expand output, and we have policies that contract output or provide a mechanism to manage that output, if you want to think of it that way. And I think that the consumer is probably the net beneficiary if you think of it that way. Now, the same economics department that teaches economic theory teaches welfare economics. And these PhDs that have gone through those classes ought to be clamoring for compensation from the consumer to the producer. Because that's what that's what the compensation theories that are the modern welfare theories suggest. Now, the bugaboo there is that in order for this policy to be better than that policy, you don't actually have to make the compensation. It just has to be possible. Well, now we're doing it. Let's say, if we were doing it, well then they should be interested in doing it. So the arguments that we see from an economic theory standpoint and from to me don't stand up for those reasons. And I'm sure there'll be plenty of people who disagree with that. All right. Why is it that the invisible hand doesn't do its magic in agriculture? Why is it that when production goes up and prices go down, we don't have a reduction in the output and an increase in the quantity demanded, and everything is right again? Why is that? Well, we're going to talk about the economics, but there are some things that we can say that are obvious too. We know that there are not very many commodities that you have to have every day. You have to have air, you have to have water, you have to have food. And your teenage daughter may think that she's going to die if she doesn't get the latest J-Lo CD or whatever. But 6 months from now, she'll probably be alive, or there'll be other reasons if she's not. If food, that isn't the case. You cannot delay the use of food. And you can't wait until the price goes down before you stock up. You just have to have it every day. So there's some very good reasons why they're different, and we know what they are, but we don't always take it follow it through to what the policy implications are. We want to have excess capacity in this country. We should always have it. We need it for ourselves, we need it for the next generations. That is a good thing, okay? There's also a lot of uncertainty associated with it for a given year. There's a lot of variability, and that's why we have to worry about the ever-normal granary, for example. Okay, so those are some of the reasons that they're different. But for some of those same reasons, we have, as a society, in this country and in other countries, have decided to invest in agriculture. In this country, almost from day one, we started giving land away. In 1792, I think it was, we first started that. And we've continued it for many years. And we've had yield increasing and cost decreasing technologies, and that's been primarily this experiment station system. You know the story, okay? We spent a lot of money on that. That is good. We need that. We got to have it, because we don't know how long it'll take for some of that to be beneficial, and we know that we want to stay way ahead of the curve on food. Food is the one thing that we do not want to take a chance on, okay? Now, that productive capacity in agriculture, I argue then, is really determined by the amount of technology that's out there. And why is that? Because farmers have to use it, basically. Because if you don't, you get behind, and you get a low price, and you have a high cost. Now, the first people that adopt the technology, we know that they're going to be better off. When everybody adopts it, the price goes down. But there's this treadmill where you have to continually adopt new technology as it comes along. That new technology basically determines how much we can produce in agriculture. Okay? Now, in other industries, that's not the case. They do a very deliberate studies to determine how much they want their productive capacity to increase over the next decade or two. They don't just leave it to chance. So they make some very detailed estimates of that. Farmers have no choice but to use all the technology all the time. Now, just because the demand just because the technology increases output at a fairly fast rate, that doesn't mean that prices are going to be necessarily low, especially if it increases slower than demand. And it did in the 70s, right? Output increased at a slower rate than demand in the 70s, and prices went up. That was not the situation generally. In general, demand does not increase as fast, okay? Now, why is that? Well, for most commodities, it's income and population that are the most important shifters in domestic demand. If you double your income, you're probably going to buy more clothes, a bigger car, more vacations, all of these kinds of things. But if you double your income, you're not going to double your expenditures for food. It just isn't going to happen. So you have a different kind of expansion situation for food than you do for other commodities. If the price of food drops by 50%, you're not going to go from one meal or from 3 meals to 5 meals. I argue that food is more like insulin to a diabetic than it is to any other commodity. Why is that? If you're a diabetic, you'll pay whatever they want for insulin, okay? Now, if the price drops by 90%, are you going to buy more? No, you're going to buy only what you need. Food isn't quite that inelastic, but it's very close. It's not something that expands with price like other commodities. I argue that on the crop output side, we have the same kind of situation for some of the reasons we've already talked about. Farmers use all their capacity all the time. They don't say prices are low, I'm not going to plant to that 160 on the backside. No, they use all of their land all the time. And they can't influence price, okay? Now, what happens in other industries? We know that if they were looked at their inventories and their sales and it wasn't at the levels that they wanted, they would reduce their output by reducing the number of hours of a shift, reduce the shifts. They would do whatever it took to get output to the point that it was more in line with demand. And if they thought that that was not going to be a long-run situation, they would shut down a plant. And they'd take it totally off the industry list, I would say. And why would they do that? They're not going to sell it to another competitor in the same industry. For example, if Firestone has too many plants and they realize it in the long run, they're going to have to drop one of these, they are not going to be able to sell it to Goodyear, and then you continue on to produce tires if there's an overproduction of tires. It goes totally off the industry list into some other kind of use, the plant, the equipment, and everything. Now, in agriculture, it doesn't work like that, does it, for crop farming? The land stays in agriculture just about irrespective of the situation. Now, if you're right around Des Moines here, or if you have special circumstances, obviously you can convert your land into something else, and if you're in certain parts of the West and the East and so on. But if you're in the major areas of agricultural production, that land stays into production. It's just a matter of who it is that's farming it, okay? So, if you put all this together, then this is why we have chronic price and income problems. We generally have growth in output that exceeds the growth in demand, and that causes a price to decline, okay? Now, in any other industry, that wouldn't be a problem because they would self-correct. But in this industry, it does become a problem because we have forces at bay here that prevent that self-correction. Okay, so that's the basic thing. All right, let me get to the end of this. The Wallaces were very good at keeping their eye on the ball, and it wasn't a matter of philosophy, political party, being for or against international trade. It was for what was best for agriculture. Okay, they were for promoting the economic well-being of folks in agriculture, and they considered a lot of different things. One of the things that Wallace A considered was McNary-Hagan bills, in which they would essentially have a high